Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Some people coming in. So we'll start in about a minute or two just to get more people coming into Zoom. For those that are not joining us, good evening, good afternoon, or good morning. Again, we'll start in about a minute or two. For those joining us now, we'll start in about a minute so we can respect everyone's time. Well, let's start the program. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's program. My name is Bora, and I'm the Assistant Director of Programs and Director of Studies at the Tower Center. Just want to go some guidelines. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function throughout the program. We want this to be as interactive as possible, so ask questions throughout the program. And then also, if you have any comments, please use the chat function. I would like to introduce our moderator this evening. As many of you know him, but he is director of the Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia, senior fellow at the Tower Center, and professor at SMU. It's the one and only Dr. Hiroki Takeuchi.
Thank you, Bora, for the introduction. Again, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Hiroki Takeuchi, Director of the Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia in the SMU Tower Center. Welcome to the SMU Tower Center Sun and Star webinar series. Before introducing today's speaker, let me introduce next event, next week's Sun and Star webinar. Let me share the screen. Next week, we will feature Dr. Kristen Bekasi, a professor at the University of Maine. She's going to talk about China and the Japanese multinational politics and risks of doing business. So today we are going to talk about Belt and Road Initiative. Last week, we talked about Japanese business reinvention. And the next week, we were talking about Japanese multinational business in China. So now I stop sharing. Okay, now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Min Ye. Dr. Ye is now a very long-time friend of mine. She is a professor of international relations at Boston University. I think we have met for the first time when we were both graduate students. She went to Princeton University for a PhD, and she got PhD of political science over there, and then currently teaching at Boston University. Among the numerous works that she has written, I would like to talk about, introduce two books that she has written. One book, the first book she wrote is this one, Diasporas and Foreign Direct Investment in China and India. And then today, she is going to talk about her most recent book, The Belt, Road, and Beyond, State-Mobilized Globalization in China, 1998 to 2018. She is a political economist and then talking about international political economy of China. She's writing about international political economy of China, taking into in consideration the perspective of domestic politics, which actually we share the common interest that domestic politics is very important to consider foreign policy. And for some reason, American American debates on China always miss that point. So please join me for welcoming Dr. Ming Ye.
Well, thank you very much. I want to start by really thanking Hiroki for inviting me to give a talk. And it's great to be back to the Tao Center. Again, it's my pleasure to introduce my studies of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And undoubtedly, this is a major undertaking, although its significance, in my view, is different from casual or geopolitical observers of the Belt and Road Initiative. So today I will share my views. I do not pretend, because there are so many excellent research and publications coming from different countries, in particular in Southeast Asia and the United States as well, on this strategy. So my I'm just a more luckier, I guess, like the timing worked well, and a more astute and engaged observer on what's going on inside China from the origin to the process and to the change and adaptation. So I'm not a practitioner, so I'll just report what I discover, and it creates the conceptual framework that can help outsiders to understand the Byzantine politics of China, in particular the domestic politics of foreign policy, as simply as possible. Right. So with that, I will start my prepared slides, and I welcome any comments and questions from the audience, and I look forward to the exchange in a few minutes. Okay. To me, time myself. Okay. Okay. So this is a book. It's about China. It's started with the Belt Road, but I ended up with tracing back to China's globalization since the Asian financial crisis in 1997. So the whole story covered is the 20 years from 1998 to 2018. I also think that 20 years is really the most significant 20 years in China's economic rise. In 1998, for example, Chinese GDP was less than a quarter of a Japanese one. And 2018, of course, the ratio flipped. But more than that, it's how the government adapt to globalization, and how the government works with globalization and deals with crises and the risk of globalization. And that mechanism was really revealed in these 20 years. So I think as we now start looking at China since then, and in the next decades or next 2 decades, right? And that learned lessons and learned mechanisms and learned the ways how to do things in China are likely to continue. So that's why I think these 20 years really tells us a lot about China, the process of change from the middle power to a superpower, but just as important, how it's going to utilize its superpower in the next stage of development. Okay, so as we are on the Belt Road Initiative, right? So most of the common images of Belt Road, I use the most simplest one because I think Belt Road is so so ambitious, but also very ambiguous, and the less actually captures more, right? So the common images are really these land-based connectivity, the Silk Road economic belt, and then the maritime-based maritime Silk Roads, as well as a number of economic corridors connecting China with South Asian countries, right? But as along those lines, then you have different major infrastructure pointers as ports, railways. So that's how external or recipient observers look at the Belt Road. I think we can learn a lot from that kind of overarching story. Right? And again, I find many scholars have done excellent work on that images, right? Going through the specific ports, projects in particular country, right? And I started my interest in the Belt Road also because of this picture, this image. But as I started to do research in China, and I find what are most interesting and least studied by foreign scholars are what's happening in China. Right? So the inside China and these different governments, local governments, that they make a very ingenious connections with these imaginary lines. Right? So in the image on the left, and you have this line like China is all a blank. Right? But actually, it's really what's inside China, the hundreds of cities and that create projects in the name of the BRI or create programs in the names of BRI. I think that's how the BRI is significant, why it's so attractive to the Chinese leadership and to the Chinese state and business as well. And frankly, that's also why it has a certain buy-in from regional actors and other development actors, precisely because of these domestic opportunities and domestic process that's going on. So I will introduce the framework that I formulate to understand how China utilize this grand strategy, as major nationalist strategies to mobilize the state and business actors and to achieve economic expansion. And so that's a story. But to understand that, it takes a bit understanding of domestic politics. And here I'm simplifying the domestic politics, but with this simplified formula, it still might be a bit complicated. And so it might be too simple to experts and too complicated to non-political scientists. And if you guys have questions, feel free to reflect on this figure that I construct. Right? So I formulate the Chinese state as consisting of three major blocks. Right? And the first block is a party leadership. So you have this individual head of the party, and then the party bureau, the 7 standing members, and then the 25 plus alternative members. And then you have central committee that elect the party leadership, the groups. And then in terms of major foreign policy and domestic policy, and the policies that are so important to the national development and national integrity, the Chinese party also established this, what we call small leading groups. And the small leading groups, they typically is chaired by one member of the party leadership. So that's the parties block. And then at the national level, then China has a very large bureaucracy. And so the bureaucracy, there'll be, in China, it's called the State Council, and headed by the premier. And then underneath it, there'll be dozens of functional bureaucracy, right? And the most important one inside China is a National Development and Reform Council. And I will argue, because of the peculiar political economy of China, this NDRC, this National Development Reform Council, which is supposed to serve national economy, may have more influence on foreign policy and China's power abroad than these functional bureaucracies in charge of diplomacy and international commerce. But this bureaucracy has more resources and can call on more projects. All projects are going abroad need approval from this bureaucracy, and so that's the second major block. And the last one, so in China, all policies made or decided in Beijing tend to be vague. And then the supranational actors actually are the implementers and often interpreters of the policies, and with their own expertise, their own resources, and their own preferences. So this is a story, and they are mutually influencing each other. So with that structure, then the expected and also observed the authority in China and the policy process tend to be fragmented. And so what's being made in the party might be different from the state, and then further different and further deviated by the supranational actors. Right? And the policy initially launched from policy implemented, and then to the policy outcome, they are typically junctures. So that's really rooted in this three block system. And then parties' main role, other than these people, right, these institutions, these power, they also are in charge of organization, right? So how the party controls the directions of the state bureaucracy and supranational actors is through organization. And so the power of appointments and promotion of these officials in the state and in the supranational units, and they are largely in charge of ideology. Right? So in terms of economy and specific investment policies or specific foreign policy, they don't really intervene a lot, but the big ideology level, then that's the party's messaging. So as I go through the 20 years development in China, and then plus my previous book, the China and India book that essentially focused on China from the 1980 to 2000. And so as I gather from this research, I find that the Chinese ideology and so cohesive ideology are really three levels. So I call it three-tiered ideology. And the first tier, often used by the political leadership to mobilize the state and to mobilize society, is nationalism. They usually do not justify any major policy based on functional arguments, like how this will bring up the economy, or how much employment that's going to be created, jobs are going to be created. Rather, major the policy launch is typically how this pertains to the great nation, the modernization of the country, the rise of China. Right? So these are very nationalist rhetoric and vision and markers. And then at the middle level, I say, and when we look at the state bureaucracy, the regulators, their industrial policies, and their foreign economic policies, then development is the guiding ideology. And so how this will help China develop technology from one level income bracket to the next, and how they achieve structural economic rebalancing or technology improvement. So it's all pertained to development. But then we look at local governments, and when we pay attention to actual market decisions or investment decisions, and then it's very broadly, I observe that it's the market forces are the driver. And so the kinds of calculations of profits and returns and costs. So that is broadly describing ideology in China. And now move to the state-mobilized globalization, right? So the idea is the major policies are disjunctured, right? So we observe start by the political leadership, like promoting a national strategy. Okay? And that's most of outside observers tend to look at, the leaders make the statement, so the policy came about. And in this book, I go to the origins, and we'll find in the announcements of these major national strategies, like the Belt and Road Initiative, there were important different drivers, right? So the economic driver was very prevalent, and the diplomatic arguments for this kind of policy was very salient, and then geostrategists were also arguing for that kind of shift. So policy proposals, policy ideas were there, and yet at the bureaucratic level, no policies were passed to address the imperatives that the Chinese state was facing. Right? And then when we continue the policy analysis, right? So the political leadership announced the rhetoric, which is nationalist and very vague. And then when, so my interest will be looking at the actual policy programs and the actors. And here in the book, I find how local actors and companies self-interpret and reinterpret in the process of implementation, right? So you have national strategy that because of state paralysis, they needed to come from the political leadership, and then implementation has largely different from the state. So the empirical cases are straightforward. So I follow the temporal dimension to look at the three strategies. The Western Development Program announced in 1999. So I look at the origins of the WDP and the different phases of projects and policies, and so and until the launch of the BRI in 2012. Right? So it also ran through three presidents, and so how they change over time tells a very rich story of the Chinese the bureaucracy and the relationship between the political leadership and the bureaucracy. So the second historical or process analysis is China Goes Global. Right? So it was announced in 2000, and then it urges Chinese companies to go global and to acquire overseas markets and overseas resources. But again, in the 15 years of the China Goes Global, CGG, and then the policy priorities and actors, of course, also have been rather different. And the Belt and Road Initiative only is about 4 years when I finished my research. And in those 4 years, it already went through 2 stages, right? From tentative proposition to nationwide mobilization. And then in 2017, it really was promoted as the project of the century. Right? But then actually from 2017 to 2019, things already had been toned down. And now with COVID, we are yet to see a new phase of the BRI. So again, it's more recent, but the kinds of stages and steps are traceable. And so, and then in each of these cases, the strategies I focus on the political leadership, right? How the political leadership, why the leadership promotes these programs, and what were the primary motivations. And then I focus on the bureaucracy and interest groups, how they interpret and concretize these vague political rhetoric. And then the last analysis is based on subnational dimension. So in the localities, I chose different types localities and look at when a state capital is dominant and how these localities implement the top-down strategy and versus different localities. Right? So there are 3 types comparison, and then companies, I separate them into different ownership and different sectors to see to what extent they implement the strategies. So that's the empirical cases. And just to summarize the empirical findings, the first question answered is why the Chinese leader launched BRI. Right? And I map out 3 sources. The strategic source was pre-existing proposal of China Goes West, driven by intensified US-China competition and China's difficulties with maritime neighbors, such as Japan and Southeast Asian maritime countries. And similar to this is in the diplomacy, and the diplomats have been proposing and testing out the infrastructure connectivity. So what they call infrastructure diplomacy. And the last one, it's the overcapacity. And so overcapacity was very severe in 2012. And the overcapacity actually really pertains to the foundation of the Chinese state, but all the local governments are in this hole, and state-owned companies are in this hole. So that is regime threatening a crisis, and so the BRI was the 2 announcements came, and then it got interpreted very quickly by the different interests and different arguments. Right? So national agencies, they interpret policies according to their own needs, and I will show shortly. And local governments also have their own programs in place. And then what are the outcomes? The book, it's a stage report, right? So by 2017, then it kind of solved certain overarching or motivating crises, but it created a new one, right? So China was celebrating the BRI as a project of the century, but just as that high status, it created much more tension with foreign governments, with recipient societies, as well as creating a lot more financial risk and debt issues inside China. Right. So overall, the 20 years from the WDP to CGG to BRI, and the how the government, the political leadership uses these grand strategies to mobilize the state machine to stimulate the economy and to stabilize its rapid growth. I think that is a foundation for China's transition from a middle power to a superpower. Right? So I will share with you this one particular sections in the BRI chapter. So the BRI rhetoric meets reality. And since now most of us cannot travel to China, so we rely more on online materials and archives, right? So the reports, remarks by Chinese leaders, by top bureaucracies, those actually we can find rather easily. But then that provides a lot of information. And so here I will show that they both provide rich information, but also we needed to be more careful of the audience and read the whole reports rather than skimming through these terms. Right? So for example, President Xi gave 39 speeches on BRI in the first two years. And often observers find his remarks to be rather hollow, right? Because it's very rhetorical and lack of substance. And here, as I go through all his remarks, and I demonstrate that he has a target audience, right? So if he's talking to multilateral audience, he tends to be very imprecise and just throw these bigger words. But if it's bilateral settings, you'll find more concrete proposals, projects that were put together by the supranational actors and bureaucracies. And when Xi was speaking or mobilizing domestic actors, then he either uses nationalism as a vision, but also he proposed financing instruments to incentivize Chinese actors to participate. And then the premier, Li Keqiang, did not give lots of talks about the BRI, but the talks that he gave were almost singly focused on capacity cooperation. And so China had overcapacity issue, and the idea is how China could develop capacity cooperation programs under the BRI. And if we look at the projects level, we'll find that the capacity cooperation actually is the main focal content of the BRI. So Li's role in the BRI is much stronger than the rhetoric would show. And the first small leading group's chairman of the BRI was Zhang Gaoli, and his main roles in the initial stage was to promote local participation. And more interestingly, so the chapter also present how these different regulators, so the NDRC, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MAFCOM, which is the Ministry of Commerce in charge of foreign trade. And so they and their affiliated think tanks, they rapidly rolled out their proposals and ideas, but most of them were already in place before the BRI. And more interestingly is the other, so in the 18 activities by other industries or ministries, for example, the SAFE or Ministry of Transportation, railways. These actually are extremely resourceful, so they rolled out the pre-existing projects and budgets very, very rapidly. And those typically are not, the nuances are difficult to catch if we don't go into the depths of the archival materials. So I'll quickly finish up here is the 3 cities. So I select Chongqing in Western China, and Ningbo near Shanghai, and Wenzhou in southern Zhejiang. And so they represent like 3 types of economic regions and 3 types of economic system in China. So I was interested in how they adapt the national strategy in their local implementation, right? So Chongqing certainly is a very important player in the BRI. So they had the China-European Railways that was before the BRI, but got a new life after the BRI. Right? And then they came up with 3 state-owned companies and plus 1 other, so 3+N programs to jointly go global. And then they spin off e-commerce companies, and they developed the e-commerce experiment zone as well. And lastly, it's the China-Singapore financial zone that became its signature BRI. And so these were collaborations of Chongqing state-owned companies and the national think tanks in Beijing. And Ningbo is a city near Shanghai. So Ningbo's main agenda was to increase its global profile. Right? It's very successful, but not to the level of Shanghai and Hangzhou, which are their neighbor. So they try to boost its global profile as a global city. So they created the Maritime Silk Road Shipping Index. And then the 16+1 consortium was also their efforts. And then they eventually became the Zhejiang BRI experiment zones. So again, very strategically planned by the local governments. And the last case is a liberal case, right? So, or market-based interpretation. So in Wenzhou, they had 2 major programs. One is the exports, goods expo in Italy, and the other one is a major industrial park, a new industrial park, but that's in Xi'an. So it's still called BRI implementation, but the main site is inside China. Okay, so I will leave it here and then conclude the BRI before COVID and then end quickly with BRI after COVID. So let's conclude the BRI in the book. So I demonstrate that the state-mobilized globalization is really important to China's rise. And in this process of 20 years, we show the state plays very strong roles, but market mechanism and market actors are heavily encouraged and supported and mobilized. And they play different in different stages of the policy. And then in terms of the Chinese state system, we continue to see commercial tendency and continue to see fragmentation, even when the BRI was clearly President Xi's promotion. The next one, as a project level, again, the book kind of the research ends in 2017, 2018, and I think that still applies today. And that is many BRI projects actually are inside China or have very strong domestic link. Right? So the kinds of fragmented mobilization are very prevalent among the Chinese implementers. And so that demonstrates a clear mismatch. Right? So Chinese actors, the business, the local governments, the central state, they are very comfortable doing their own project this way through mobilization and then self-interpretation. But that's not common outside China. And so the outside China, the expectation of transparency is very high, and China could not provide. Right? So there's a constant tension between this China's process and the recipient's reaction. And then COVID occurred. Right? So the common, very popular views. So I selected a few, but there are a lot more. So in February, in January, February, March, April, there were lots of writings about how the BRI is dead because of COVID. And because the people perceives BRI as a transmitter of COVID, and they also see that the COVID indicates problems inside China, and even the major supporters of BRI in Pakistan, Italy, they all have shown second thoughts on the BRI. Right? So then I did. I follow my state mobilized analysis, and then I focused on Chinese materials and to look at to answer this question: will China continue the BRI? If it does, and how it might be different from before COVID. Right? So the research have two parts, and first part is I look at all the publications by Chinese scholars / bureaucrats. So when they coming from a strategic point of view and from diplomatic point of view and from economic point of view. Right? So how they think about the BRI and China's overall strategy in globalization after COVID. And then I also look at the activities conducted by state agencies, local governments, and state-owned companies, and then the scientists. The COVID really brings out major effects on scientists. So the findings show that at policy option level, right, then there's strong backings for continuity. And so BRI is mentioned as one way to address deteriorating US-China relations, as one way to continue China's outbound globalization, and it is necessary for China's own economic recovery and revival. Right. And then the activities by agencies and local governments and scientists in particular are very robust in continuing the BRI. Right? So that was clear by June 2020, right, this year, when the Chinese finished their 2 sessions, and those trends were clear, continuity and the new and a renewed interest in globalization. But the latter part of this year, and so July, August, and now I think we can see some new trends as well. There are 2 directions. There are both continuities and the change. In terms of BRI and inside and outside, the connections are still very clear. And so China now is focusing on inside, but how the inside priorities can be connected with the BRI, those will go faster than other BRI projects. So for example, China established, so in this year, the e-commerce zones, right? So e-commerce zones in China, they started in 2015 in the context of the BRI, and there are only 5 cities. And then in 2019, before the COVID, and they grow very fast, e-commerce zones grow very fast, so they expanded to 49 cities. But then in April, 1 month, so they increased to 105. Right? So that's big expansion. And in BRI, they begin to fund and support these e-commerce zones and offline, online industrial parks and logistic parks. So that we'll see more of those projects on the BRI. And then the other major move in China is a new infrastructure planning. And the proposal were repeated in 2018 and 2019, but only when COVID occurred, it quickly became a national policy. It got cross-agency support and began to be promoted locally. So all the Chinese localities come up with their own plans to implement the new infrastructure planning. And my analysis of different localities implement the new infrastructure planning differently also is applied. And to on BRI, there are two things China talk a lot nowadays, the digital Silk Road and the health Silk Road, right? And I think these are both quite controversial, but are likely the new direction. Again, to what extent this will become a very fastly expanding program versus a more narrowly conceived program, it really depends how the domestic and global connections work in the next 5 years, right? So China is talking about internal circulation. So they are doing this inside China, but how the internal circulation and the external circulation can really create what the Chinese call dual circulation. Then we'll see next 5 years, we probably will know more. Okay, thank you so much. And I think I'll take too much time.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So let's start the discussion. So if you have any question or comments, please write it in Q&A box, and then I will try to take it as much as we can. The first question that I'd like to ask is, it was actually about COVID. So you talked about it a little bit, and then my take is it seems that because BRI was originally framed and defined very ambiguously, so now there is a need for COVID, and then it also can fit very well. Because it is like original framework was very ambiguous. Mm-hmm. My question is there any change in the relationship between local government and like foreign actors? So you talk about, Wenzhou and Italy, for example. But so my question is, particularly for local government, what is the impact of pandemic on the relationship between local government and foreign actors?
So that's a very good question. I think that because when outsiders report this China's health aid or different rescue teams, right? Then they see China. But if we look at these teams, like who were sponsoring them and who were the members, actually it's local, right? So you'll find a team from Zhejiang, or why Italy received the most of PPE donation from China. It's not China. It's Wenzhou, right? Wenzhou, that's their main sites. In Cambodia, where do they get those PPE? It's Jiangsu, because Jiangsu has major special economic zones in Cambodia. The Sihanoukville special economic zone really is Jiangsu's project, right? So it's very interesting that so China is like, you have the Beijing rallies, right? So they can chantou, right? So they connect, but it's really the local teams. They provide resources and manpower. Big Beijing, this bureaucracy, they don't have that kind of resources and manpower.
Great. Our colleague, Harold Tanner, who is teaching Chinese military history at University of North Texas, asks the role of military. Is military a relevant actor, and if so, how?
Yeah, so there are two things. First, most of the phases that I cover here, the military was not an important player. So military tried to stay away from the discourse. There are two things. One is the Chinese foreign policy has a tradition that they do not like to militarize their foreign policy, because the legacy of colonialism, independence movement. So China has this aversion of militarized foreign policy. Number two, they also correctly calculate that if you bring military arguments in, then the acceptability of the BRI will be in danger, right? So out of shrewd calculation, they also did not feature centrally or even importantly. But I think after 2017, and in particular, as you begin to have real threats, and so and the Chinese assets and personnel overseas are becoming the Chinese liability. So we begin to see the military people or think tanks affiliated with the military, or the publications in the military newspapers begin to talk about how the military should be geared to deal with issues related to the BRI project. So by 2019, I think the military voices are rising, but it's more kind of following the conditions on the ground. So the statecraft kind of came after the economy. And I can see for the long-term future, right? So, for example, there is a report by Asia Society. It says weaponization of the BRI. So the idea is China has ownership of these ports, of these railways, and of those infrastructure. And in the events of military conflicts or operation by PLA, those could become dual use assets. That I can tell for now, right? That we will see.
Okay, good. Question about innovation from impact on the innovation from private enterprises. So, roughly saying there are two actors, that state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, and they are very creative and innovative in terms of using central strategy of Belt and Road Initiative. So. Our student Savuni Desai asked, do you think the top-down developmental initiatives and market forces reinterpreting ambiguous strategies do you think it stifles innovation from private corporations and local governments?
That's a very good question. So I will say that the main source of innovation and the main source of wealth generation in China came from the private sector. And so that's a statistical facts. But in my investigation of the state-mobilized globalization, I do see that the government intervention helping expand the market reach, right? And so expanding market size, right? So for example, even the WDP, the way that China connects coastal China with central and western China. So these private sectors have much bigger market to play with. That is very central to the success of private sector. The other one is state companies in China mostly monopolize infrastructure, right? And we criticize this, But on the other hand, the state ownership of infrastructure also makes it very, very affordable. So the cost of operation for private sector are just very, very cheap compared to other countries. So again, in the private sector are the main generator of wealth, but it looks like the state helps at critical as a critical condition too.
Great. Several questions are centered on the main question that Robin really Robin Lightstone really nicely summarized. So do you think the program BRI succeed? So what are the pros and cons of BRI? And then, more specifically, Stephen Raub, our Tower Center Forum member, says there are reports of pushback from countries that initially embraced BRI. So what is your assessment of the impact on China's international reputation? Ed Arnott, also a member of Tower Center, asked, China has a reputation for predatory finance of foreign infrastructure projects. What is your view? So overall, is it good thing, successful?
Yeah, so Hiroki, can you repeat the last sentence? What's China's reputation?
Yeah, what is the one question is, what is your assessment of the impact on China's international reputation?
Yeah.
Another one is that China has a reputation for predatory finance of foreign infrastructure projects. So what is your view?
Risky finance? Yeah.
Or predatory or predation, right? So it's like a more aggressive.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I see the BRI as China's state-mobilized globalization strategy, right? So its main target and why it's significant is how the political leadership can cohere in a state bureaucracy that were fighting were paralyzed, and how the political leadership can incentivize and mobilize local governments actively pursue new investment opportunities and new projects, domestic and international. So from that point of view, it's a success. And whether like they achieve 10% of return on the overseas investments, that actually is never the concern. So that they will decide. They say that's company levels decision. You know, if they have revenue, then they continue. If they don't find it profitable, then the scope that's decided by the company and project level. In terms of international reputation, I think the Chinese think of this way, is they are aware of this criticism, right? But they also are aware because of the BRI launch, because of these heavy headline numbers connected to the BRI. So China has a voice power, right? So they've been looking for this 话语权 for a very long time, and under this BRI context, they got it, right? So from that again, it's a Chinese geostrategic perspective. The getting China more likable or less likable is secondary to the sense that China now has voice power, and BRI propels China having more voice power. So again, the Beijing's calculation, it's a success. In terms of specific criticism and project financing, the Beijing's calculation will deal with it. So there'll be the second summit, right? So the BRI second summit in 2019, basically. The hundreds of agreements that they passed were to address those concerns. And I do think if there were no COVID, and when the moderate BRI number 2 gets implemented, some of the reputation will be fixed, but it will also be a smaller BRI than the Chinese leader portrayed in 2017.
I'd like to kind of expand Tatiana's question about the BRI in the Middle East.
Mhm.
So in the period of time of the last 20 years overlaps with the U.S. Middle East policy, very much like a changing U.S. Middle Eastern policy. So I think that currently that there is a kind of vacuum in the Middle East after U.S. kind of is trying to withdraw from the Middle East. So overall, so is China filling that gap, that vacuum?
Mhm. That's a very good observation. I can only offer my very partial observation. I think at a geopolitical level, China do not think it has ability to replace the United States. They are very inexperienced in dealing with Middle East complex issues. Right? So they don't want to touch the thorny issues in Middle East. So that as a region-wide perception. And then, but at bilateral level, right? So bilateral level, then China does boost its relationship with Saudi. Right? So Saudi became one of the largest partner for the BRI, and but China has very large port companies. And so these ports company invest in Saudi and contracting their services, management. So there are that's been booming. And then Israel, right? So Israel has historical ties with China, and then under the BRI they are rebooted and renewed. And Israel, because Israel has a high-tech services center in particular in the net security area, is a very big player. Right? So you begin to see Alibaba moving to Israel. So that's a private trend as well. And the other country is Iran, right? So China does enjoy very special relationship with Iran, and Iran provides a big potential market for Chinese producers and for Chinese goods. But then the precondition is the U.S. relations with Iran. So if the deal by Obama was passed, then the Chinese companies were already making the deals and planning big deals. And then when the Iran deal was cut, then I think that affects Chinese business interest in Iran too, because they cannot have ways to address the transaction issues.
Well, it has become 7:30, but I'd like to go a little bit over time because there are so many questions still left unanswered. So I'd like to ask two more questions. So the one question is two people like Jack Swearingen and also Ed Arnold asked the question, the digital element of the BRI. So could you comment on that?
So the digital BRI, right? Okay. So I forgot to read the Q&A boxes.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I'll just offer the origin. Number one, digital BRI get lots of criticism and concerns in the West, in the United States, and the Western countries, because we know how dangerous that the digital things will be, right? So if you identify BRI as a geostrategic strategy, and then digital BRI, that means that China is using its digital infrastructure and digital control to dominate this open space. So it's very concerning from Westerners' point of view. And then from going back to China, and then the process of digital BRI, then I have to say that it started, the digital Silk Road actually started by scientists, right? So basically the scientists say that, so you had this BRI and that BRI, they feel that we should also talk about digital BRI, so that e-commerce, smart cities, right, and cellular towers, communication. These are all part of the digital BRI, and there are so many digital companies in China that can join, can be part of the BRI. So in Southeast Asia, you'll find in Southeast Asia, then it's the smart city project goes very fast. And in Pakistan, that's the Telecommunication Foundation. In Pacific, that's under tunnel cables, right? So they have different elements, but because of external the sensitivity to it. So after 2019, basically the Chinese private actors became more careful. They realized, so previously they thought their ventures that have digital BRI, has BRI in their name, makes it more profitable or more operationable, right? But then they realize actually it's a bad reputation, so they are trying to sever the relationship. And after COVID, so China is at the dilemma. They feel digital BRI with these smart cities, cloud technology, e-commerce, telecommunication infrastructure are China's strengths and have huge profit margin overseas, but they can't really brand the BRI as digital because of their lots of geostrategic concerns with it.
The last question, this is actually good for the last question because it's actually more for future oriented. So, most of the companies participating in the BRI are state-owned enterprises, and so more than private companies. And do you think that this trend will change in the future? And also, McCabe Callagher, my historian colleague, asks like a more in general question of how is situation changing? How is BRI changing? And what's the perspective of the future?
Yeah, so again, very good observations. So first of all, by volume, and by volume, China's outbound investment, I think in starting 2015, the private money has taken over FDI, right? So taking over state-owned companies, and that's a big deal because China used to have like 80% of FDI contributed by state companies, and then after 2015, that's about equal, and then was private money is overtaking it. I think now, if the BRI regions, it does seem by volume that state banks are the main financiers, because lots of projects involved infrastructure development and special economic zones, right? So special economic zone money typically come from the Exim Bank, and infrastructure and the money typically come from China Development Bank. And when the banks, the state banks are the main financiers, they usually work with state-owned infrastructure companies, and yet under the infrastructure company, you have the lots of the private companies will be bidding. So it's I think by number, perhaps the private companies are more salient, but by the money, the funds, then the state will be the major one. So the idea is, for example, when the Chinese invest in Pakistan or Africa, right, Kenya, for example, this export processing zone. The zone requires state financing to construct, but eventually it's the shoemakers, the Chinese private players that will be there. Right? Again, it varies by region. So Vietnam, for example, will be more private than state. So Southeast Asia, which already has relatively good market and economic foundation, private investors are more salient than other places. In the future, well, I think if the previous strategy is any guidance, then BRI will stay. But when circumstances change, the content will shift. Okay? So I think in the next few years, we'll see some of the revival of infrastructure, because you still need to build infrastructure, right? And it will be bifurcation between developing countries and versus more advanced countries, and then the health will be a bigger sector, because China itself, not because they presented the health BRI, but because China domestically, they are rebooting lots of investments internally in the health sector, right? And other countries are also increasing their demands for health sector projects. So that's going to be a big deal. And digital side, let's move away with digital, but I think e-commerce, smart cities, and clean energy, these will be will go faster than others, merely because these are the new growth poles and major destination or investments inside China. And so that's my point, that foreign market activities or foreign activities of China are very much contingent on its domestic trends.
Right. Yeah, one question was actually from about the e-renminbi by the Chinese Central Bank, and I apologize that I couldn't take that question. This is a topic that we can talk forever, and then also BRI is really something that that will be easy to change. Therefore, that will be relevant for the future also. So China's international political economy is very dynamic, and then each actor is very innovative to use the central government's policy, and that's actually really interesting. Thank you, Min. So before closing, two housekeeping things. First, like some people asked us whether slides are available. Our answer is the video will be available, so you can see the slides through the video. So it will be available soon on the Tower Center website. And then before closing, let me mention about the next week's Sunstar webinar. That will be, by Dr. Kristen Bekasi of the University of Maine. She's going to talk about China and the Japanese multinationals. So the Japanese businesses in China, how they handle politics and hedge the risk of doing business in China. Now, well, thank you. So please join me. Thank you very much. Thank you again for Dr. Ye for excellent presentation and great discussion. So please join me for thanking Dr. Ye virtually.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Hiroki again, and thanks to the audience. And I hope the conversation will go on. And I think China will go on, and then
yes.
Chinese will go on, right? So our conversation will go on, and I'm an observer of China, and share my observation with you guys. It's my great honor. Thank you, and good night, good morning. Okay, bye.
Yeah, and have a nice day. Good night. And then actually, vote counting is going on still, so
okay.
So that's where we are. So we will see the results soon, I hope. But thank you, Min, and we will adjourn. Thank you for joining us, and good night, or have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.